The screech of metal against metal pierced the morning air like a wounded animal's cry, followed by the thunderous crash that would change everything. Marcus Rodriguez felt the ground shake beneath his work boots as he stood at the construction site, coffee cup trembling in his calloused hands. The 742 commuter train to downtown had derailed just 50 yards from where he'd been checking the foundation measurements for another luxury apartment complex he'd never be able to afford. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Steam hissed from the overturned cars like angry serpents, and the acrid smell of burning electrical components mixed with the metallic taste of fear that suddenly filled his mouth. Without thinking, Marcus dropped his coffee and ran toward the wreckage, his tool belt jangling with each desperate stride. Behind him, he could hear his foreman, Big Jim Patterson, shouting something about staying back, about waiting for emergency responders. But Marcus's feet had already made the decision his mind was still processing. The first car had flipped completely over, its windows spiderwebbed with cracks that caught the early morning sunlight like broken diamonds. The second car lay on its side, groaning with each settling shift of twisted metal. It was from this car that Marcus heard it, a woman's voice, weak but determined, calling out in the growing haze of smoke and confusion. Help? Someone? Please. Marcus had heard desperation before. He'd heard it in his own voice 3 years ago when 8-year-old Sofia had been rushed to the emergency room with pneumonia, her small body burning with fever while he paced the waiting room in his only clean shirt, praying to a God he wasn't sure was listening to a man who could barely make rent. He'd heard it in the voices of his neighbors in the Riverside Gardens apartment complex, where thin walls carried the sounds of dreams deferred and bills unpaid. But this voice was different. It carried an authority even in its vulnerability, like someone accustomed to being heard, now reduced to hoping someone would care enough to listen. The woman was trapped beneath a section of torn metal roofing, her expensive-looking navy suit torn and dusty. Blood trickled from a cut above her left eyebrow, and her perfectly styled blonde hair had come undone from what had probably been an immaculate chignon that morning. She couldn't have been more than 35, but her eyes held the kind of weariness that comes from carrying weight that goes beyond years. "I've got you," Marcus said, his voice steadier than he felt as he assessed the twisted metal pinning her legs. His construction experience kicked in automatically, load-bearing analysis, pivot points, leverage calculations. The metal beam was heavy but not impossible to move if he could find the right angle. "What's your name?" "Victoria," she gasped, wincing as she tried to shift position. "Victoria Sterling. Are you with the fire department?" Marcus almost laughed, glancing down at his faded Carhartt jacket and steel-toed boots that had seen better decades. "Construction worker. But I know about moving heavy things." He positioned himself at the optimal leverage point, muscles straining as he began to lift. "On 3, try to pull yourself out. 1, 2, 3. The beam shifted with a grinding protest of metal on concrete, and Victoria managed to slide her legs free. Marcus could see her left ankle was already swelling, and she moved with the careful precision of someone trying not to show how much pain she was in. As he helped her stand, leaning her weight against his shoulder, he caught a glimpse of something that made him pause, the Patek Philippe watch on her wrist, the kind that cost more than he made in 2 years. "Thank you," Victoria said, her voice carrying a tremor that had nothing to do with physical pain. She looked up at him with green eyes that seemed to be memorizing his face, as if she were trying to solve a puzzle he didn't know he represented. I don't know how to thank you." "No need," Marcus replied, though something in her intensity made him uncomfortable in a way he couldn't name. "Let's get you to the paramedics." As they made their way toward the growing crowd of first responders, Victoria suddenly stopped, her grip tightening on his arm. "Wait," she said, her voice taking on an urgency that seemed disproportionate to their situation. "Your name. I need to know your name." "Marcus Rodriguez." He studied her face, noting the way her expression shifted when he said it, like recognition flickering across her features. "Why?" Before she could answer, the paramedics reached them, professional hands taking over the job of supporting Victoria as they guided her toward a waiting ambulance. But she kept looking back at Marcus over her shoulder, her green eyes holding questions he couldn't begin to understand. In the chaos of emergency vehicles and concerned bystanders, he lost sight of her, swallowed up by the efficient machinery of crisis response. Big Jim found Marcus 20 minutes later, standing by the construction trailer and staring at the rescue operation with the glazed expression of someone processing trauma. "You okay, Rodriguez? That was some hero shit you just pulled." Marcus nodded absently, but he wasn't really listening. Something about the woman Victoria Sterling nagged at him like a word on the tip of his tongue. The way she'd looked at him when he said his name, the expensive watch, the quality of her clothes despite the circumstances. And something else, something in her eyes that felt familiar in a way that made his chest tight with anxiety. "Rodriguez." Big Jim's voice cut through his reverie. "I said the site's shut down for the day. Investigation and all that. Go home to your kid, Sofia." The thought of his daughter snapped Marcus back to the present. She'd be getting ready for school right now, probably wondering why Daddy had left so early for work again. At 8 years old, she'd already learned not to ask too many questions about money or why they couldn't afford the things her classmates took for granted. But Marcus knew she noticed. Children always noticed more than adults gave them credit for. He gathered his tools slowly, methodically, the way he did everything these days, with careful attention to routine, because routine was what kept their small world stable. As he walked to his 15-year-old Honda Civic, the car that Sofia had dubbed Brave Car, because it kept running despite its obvious desire to retire, Marcus found himself replaying every moment of the rescue. Victoria Sterling. The name felt important, though he couldn't place why. He'd never moved in circles where he would meet someone who wore watches worth more than his annual salary. Never had reason to interact with the kind of people who took the 742 commuter train into the financial district. His world was concrete and steel, overtime shifts and parent-teacher conferences, grocery store coupons and careful budgeting to make sure Sofia never felt the full weight of their financial reality. As he drove through the familiar streets of his neighborhood, past the corner market where Mrs. Chun always asked about Sofia's grades, and the laundromat where he spent Saturday mornings reading her homework while their clothes tumbled, Marcus tried to shake the feeling that something had shifted in his carefully maintained universe. The woman's face lingered in his mind, not just her beauty, though she was undeniably beautiful, but the intelligence in her eyes, the way she'd said his name like it meant something more than simple identification. His phone buzzed with a text from Sofia. "Daddy, I made pancakes. They're only a little burned. Red heart." The message made him smile despite the morning's chaos. Sofia had been learning to cook, partly out of necessity since Marcus worked such long hours, but mostly out of the determined independence that seemed to define her personality. She approached challenges the way he approached construction problems, methodically, persistently, with an optimism that he sometimes envied. When he arrived at their second-floor apartment, the smell of slightly burned pancakes greeted him along with Sofia's concerned voice. "Daddy, you're home early. Are you sick?" She appeared in the doorway of their small kitchen, flour in her dark hair and worry creasing her 8-year-old features. She had his eyes but her mother's delicate bone structure, and sometimes looking at her was like seeing ghosts of a future that had been cut short. "Work got canceled," Marcus said, sweeping her into a hug that lasted longer than usual. "Something happened near the site. Nothing dangerous," he added quickly, seeing her expression shift toward alarm. "Just train accident. I helped someone." Sofia pulled back to study his face with the serious expression she wore when trying to read adult emotions. "You helped someone in a train accident? Like a hero?" "Not a hero, Mija. Just someone who was there." But even as he said it, Marcus could feel the inadequacy of the explanation. Something about the morning felt larger than his ability to categorize it, like the first tremor before an earthquake that would reshape familiar landscape into something unrecognizable. They ate the slightly burned pancakes together at their small kitchen table, the same table where Sofia did her homework every evening while Marcus reviewed construction plans and worried about health insurance premiums. Through their window, Marcus could see the city skyline in the distance, the glass and steel monuments to success that felt as foreign to him as another planet. Somewhere in that gleaming landscape, Victoria Sterling was probably receiving the kind of medical care that came with excellent insurance and private rooms. "Daddy!" Sofia's voice pulled him back to the present. "You look sad." Marcus reached across the table to touch her cheek, marveling as he always did at how someone so small could read him so clearly. "Just thinking, baby. Sometimes grown-ups do that." "About the lady you helped?" The question surprised him with its accuracy. "How did you know it was a lady?" Sofia shrugged with 8-year-old wisdom. "You get different thinking face for ladies than for construction stuff." Before Marcus could figure out how to respond to that observation, his phone rang. Unknown number, local area code. He almost didn't answer. Unknown numbers usually meant bill collectors or telemarketers. But something made him pick up on the fourth ring. "Mr. Rodriguez?" The voice was crisp, professional, female. "This is Jennifer Walsh, calling on behalf of Victoria Sterling. Ms. Sterling would very much like to speak with you, if you're available." Marcus felt something cold settle in his stomach. "How did you get this number?" "Ms. Sterling is resourceful when it comes to finding people she needs to reach. She'd like to invite you to lunch today, if possible. To properly thank you for this morning." "That's not necessary," Marcus said quickly, aware of Sofia's curious eyes watching him. "Anyone would have done the same thing." "Perhaps," Jennifer Walsh said, and Marcus could hear the diplomatic smile in her voice. "But not everyone did. Just you. Would 1 p.m. work for you?" Chez Laurent downtown. Marcus had never heard of Chez Laurent, but he could guess from the name and location that it was the kind of place where lunch cost more than he usually spent on groceries in a week. "I don't think that's... I appreciate it, but..." "Mr. Rodriguez." The voice became warmer, more personal. "Victoria Sterling is not someone who takes kindness lightly. She's also not someone who takes no for an answer easily. 1 o'clock, Chez Laurent. She'll cover transportation if needed. This is important to her." The line went dead before Marcus could protest further. He stared at his phone, feeling like Alice after tumbling down the rabbit hole. His morning had started with coffee and foundation measurements. Now he was apparently having lunch with a woman who could track down his unlisted phone number in a matter of hours. "Who was that, Daddy?" Sofia asked, her pancake forgotten as she studied his expression. "The lady from the train," Marcus said slowly. "She wants to have lunch." "That's nice." Sofia's face lit up with the uncomplicated pleasure of a child who believed the world was generally a good place. "Maybe she's rich and she'll give us money, so we can fix Brave Car's air conditioning." Marcus almost choked on his coffee. "Mija, we don't ask people for money, and we don't expect rewards for helping people." "I know, Daddy, but maybe she'll offer. Rich people do that in movies." As Sofia chattered about the various ways wealthy people expressed gratitude in the films they watched together on their secondhand television, Marcus found himself wondering what Victoria Sterling wanted from him. In his experience, nothing in life came without strings attached, and people who wore expensive watches and had assistants who could find unlisted phone numbers usually wanted something more complex than simple gratitude. But underneath his wariness was something else, or curiosity, maybe, or the kind of restless feeling he remembered from before Sofia was born, when his life had still felt like it contained possibilities beyond the careful routine of survival. He hadn't realized how small his world had become until this morning, when a stranger's green eyes had looked at him like he was someone worth remembering. The clock on their kitchen wall ticked toward noon, and Marcus realized he was going to say yes to lunch, despite every practical instinct telling him to stay in his own lane, stick to what he knew, avoid complications that could upset the delicate balance of their life. But something about Victoria Sterling felt like unfinished business, like a question that would nag at him until he found the answer. He looked at his daughter, happily eating burned pancakes and humming under her breath, and wondered if he was about to make the best or worst decision of their carefully constructed life. Marcus stood in front of their small bathroom mirror, studying his reflection with the critical eye of someone who rarely had reason to worry about appearances. The face looking back at him was weathered but not old, 32 years compressed into features that had seen more struggle than triumph. His dark hair showed the first threads of premature gray, earned through night shifts and worried calculations over kitchen table bills. The The scar above his left eyebrow came courtesy of a construction accident 3 years ago, back when he'd been too proud to admit he was working while exhausted. He owned exactly 2 dress shirts, both purchased secondhand for Sofia's school functions. The blue one had a faint stain near the 3rd button that he'd never been able to completely eliminate. The white one made him look like he was trying too hard to be someone he wasn't. He chose the blue one, paired with his only tie navy blue with small gray dots that Sofia had picked out for Father's Day 2 years ago from the discount rack at Walmart. "You look handsome, Daddy," Sofia said from the doorway, her backpack already slung over her shoulders for the walk to school. She'd braided her own hair that morning, not quite evenly but with the determined pride of someone mastering new skills out of necessity. Like a prince in disguise. Marcus smiled, adjusting the tie that felt like a noose around his neck. "More like a construction worker in borrowed clothes, Mija." "Same thing," Sofia said with the absolute confidence that only 8-year-olds possessed. She walked to him and straightened his collar with small, careful hands. "Mama always said you were the most handsome man in the world." The casual mention of Elena hit Marcus like it always did. A sudden, sharp ache that time had softened but never eliminated. Sofia spoke of her mother with the matter-of-fact acceptance of a child who had never known life any different. But Marcus still felt the weight of all the conversations they'd never have, all the parenting decisions he had to make alone. Elena would have known what to wear to lunch with Victoria Sterling. Elena would have understood the social complexities of accepting charity or kindness from someone who moved in circles they'd only seen in magazines. Elena had possessed the kind of natural grace that made everyone feel comfortable, whether she was talking to the apartment superintendent or the pediatrician at the free clinic. "I wish I could meet your lady friend," Sofia continued, oblivious to the emotional journey her father's thoughts had taken. "Maybe she has kids. Maybe we could have playdates." Marcus knelt to Sofia's eye level, straightening her backpack straps with the automatic gesture of a parent who had performed this ritual hundreds of times. "Remember what we talked about, okay? This is just lunch. Just someone saying thank you. Nothing more than that." But even as he said it, Marcus wondered if he was trying to convince Sofia or himself. The morning's events had introduced an element of unpredictability into their carefully ordered life, and he wasn't sure how he felt about that. Their routine was hard-won stability after years of chaos following Elena's death. The same breakfast every morning, the same walk to Sofia's school, the same construction sites and reliable paychecks that kept their small world afloat. After dropping Sofia at school, exchanging brief pleasantries with Mrs. Morrison about the upcoming parent-teacher conferences he couldn't afford to take time off for, Marcus drove toward downtown with the windows down in his aging Honda. The air conditioning had given up the previous summer. Another repair he'd added to the growing list of things he couldn't quite afford but couldn't quite ignore either. Chez Laurent occupied the ground floor of a gleaming office building that probably cost more per square foot than Marcus's annual rent. The restaurant's windows were tinted just dark enough to suggest exclusivity without seeming pretentious, and the understated elegance of the exterior made Marcus's stomach clench with anxiety. This wasn't his world, and every instinct told him to turn around, drive home, and pretend the morning's rescue had never happened. But Victoria Sterling's green eyes lingered in his memory, along with that moment of recognition when he'd said his name. There had been something there, some connection he couldn't explain, and despite his natural caution, Marcus found himself curious about what she might reveal. The hostess was a young woman who managed to convey both warmth and subtle assessment in her greeting, her eyes taking in Marcus's carefully chosen but obviously inexpensive clothes with professional discretion. "Mr. Rodriguez? Ms. Sterling is waiting for you. Right this way, please." The restaurant's interior was everything Marcus had expected: soft lighting, crisp white tablecloths, the quiet murmur of conversations conducted in tones that suggested important decisions were being made over appetizers. Victoria Sterling sat at a corner table that offered both privacy and a view of the street, and she rose as Marcus approached, extending her hand with a smile that seemed genuinely warm rather than merely polite. She had changed clothes since the morning, trading her torn suit for a simple black dress that probably cost more than Marcus made in a month, but somehow didn't scream wealth the way he'd expected. Her left ankle was wrapped in an elastic bandage, and she moved with a slight limp, but otherwise showed no signs of the morning's ordeal. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and the cut above her eyebrow was nearly hidden by expertly applied makeup. "Mr. Rodriguez," she said, shaking his hand with a firm grip. "Thank you so much for coming. Please sit." Marcus took the chair opposite her, hyper-aware of the expensive glassware and silverware arranged with military precision around his place setting. "You didn't need to do this, Ms. Sterling. Really. Victoria, please." "And yes, I did." She studied his face with the same intensity she'd shown that morning, as if she were trying to memorize details for some purpose he couldn't fathom. "You saved my life this morning. The paramedics said if that beam had shifted another inch, it could have severed an artery in my leg. So yes, lunch is absolutely the least I can do." A server appeared with water and menus, and Marcus found himself staring at prices that made his monthly grocery budget look like pocket change. Victoria seemed to notice his discomfort and waved the menus away. "Would you mind if I ordered for both of us? I eat here often, and the chef does wonderful things with salmon." Marcus nodded, grateful not to have to navigate the menu's French terminology and astronomical prices. As Victoria placed their order with easy familiarity, he studied her more carefully. Up close, without the chaos of the accident, he could see she was younger than he'd initially thought, probably early 30s, with laugh lines around her eyes that suggested someone who smiled frequently despite the authoritative bearing that seemed natural to her. "So," Victoria said once the server had departed, "tell me about yourself, Marcus. What do you do when you're not pulling people out of train wrecks?" "Construction," Marcus said, then felt compelled to elaborate. "Residential mostly. Apartment complexes, some commercial buildings. Been doing it about 10 years now." "Do you enjoy it?" The question surprised him. Most people asked about construction work in terms of practicality or necessity, steady pay, union benefits, job security. No one had ever asked if he enjoyed it. "I'm good at it," he said finally. "I like working with my hands, solving problems. There's something satisfying about seeing a building go up, knowing you helped make something that will last." Victoria nodded as if this made perfect sense. "I imagine it's rewarding, creating something tangible. My work is mostly abstract. Numbers and projections and strategic planning. Nothing you can touch at the end of the day." "What kind of work do you do?" For just a moment, something flickered across Victoria's expression. Uncertainty, maybe, or calculation. "Business development," she said, which struck Marcus as the kind of vague answer people gave when they didn't want to explain their job. Lots of meetings, lots of spreadsheets. Not nearly as heroic as construction work. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of their lunch, salmon that looked like art on the plate, accompanied by vegetables Marcus couldn't identify and a sauce that probably had a name he couldn't pronounce. Victoria ate with the unconscious elegance of someone accustomed to fine dining, while Marcus tried not to feel like an imposter in his borrowed respectability. "Do you have family?" Victoria asked, cutting her salmon into precise, small pieces. "A daughter, Sofia. She's 8. Marcus's face automatically softened when he mentioned his daughter, the way it always did. "Smartest kid you've ever met. Wants to be a doctor when she grows up." "That's wonderful. What about your wife?" "She died when Sofia was 5. Marcus had learned to deliver this information matter-of-factly, like announcing the weather, because anything else invited pity he couldn't afford to accept. "Car accident. Just one of those things." Victoria's fork paused halfway to her mouth, and something in her expression shifted. "I'm so sorry. That must have been... I can't imagine." "We manage," Marcus said, which was his standard response to condolences. "Sofia's amazing. She keeps me going, you know? She's lucky to have you." Marcus almost laughed at that. "Lucky might not be the word I'd use. We're not exactly living the American dream, but we take care of each other." Victoria was quiet for a moment, studying her salmon as if it might contain answers to questions she wasn't sure how to ask. When she looked up, her green eyes held an intensity that made Marcus uncomfortable. "Marcus," she said carefully, "this morning, when you told me your name, have we met before? You seem familiar to me." The question hit Marcus like a physical blow, confirmation of the recognition he'd sensed but couldn't place. I don't think so. I'd remember meeting you. He paused, then decided to voice what had been bothering him all morning. But you looked at me like you knew me. When I said my name. Victoria set down her fork and leaned forward slightly, her expression taking on an urgency that seemed disproportionate to their casual lunch conversation. This might sound strange, but would you mind telling me about your family? Your background. Why? Marcus's defensive instincts kicked in, honed by years of protecting Sofia from a world that often seemed determined to prove they didn't belong anywhere. Ms. Sterling, Victoria, I appreciate the lunch, really, but I'm not sure what you're getting at. Please, Victoria said, and there was something almost desperate in her voice. Just humor me. Where were you born? What about your parents? Marcus felt like he was being interviewed for a job he hadn't applied for, but something in Victoria's expression, a vulnerability beneath the authority, made him answer despite his discomfort. Born here in the city. My mother raised me alone. My father wasn't in the picture. Mom died when I was 24. Cancer. What was your mother's name? Maria Rodriguez. Marcus's patience was wearing thin. Look, I don't understand what this has to do with anything. Why are you asking me these questions? Victoria reached into her purse and pulled out her phone, scrolling through photos with fingers that Marcus noticed were trembling slightly. She found what she was looking for and turned the phone toward him, her green eyes watching his face with laser focus. The photograph showed a young woman, probably in her early 20s, with dark hair and eyes that were unmistakably familiar because Marcus saw them in the mirror every morning. She was laughing at something beyond the camera's frame, and she wore a simple white dress that suggested the photo had been taken at some kind of celebration. Do you recognize her? Victoria asked quietly. Marcus stared at the photograph, his world tilting on its axis. That's my mother, he said slowly. But she's so young here. I've never seen this picture before. Victoria's breath caught audibly. Marcus, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I think you might be my brother. The restaurant around them seemed to fade into background noise as Marcus processed words that didn't make sense, couldn't make sense, would shatter everything he thought he knew about his life if they turned out to be true. His mother, Maria Rodriguez, had never mentioned another child. There had never been any indication that Marcus had siblings, no family photos or stories or casual references to a life before him. That's impossible, Marcus said finally, but even as the words left his mouth, he found himself staring at Victoria with new eyes, looking for resemblances he'd been too shocked to notice before. The shape of their hands was similar. Their eyes held the same flecks of gold around the edges. And something about the way she tilted her head when she was thinking reminded him of his own habits. Victoria was crying now, tears running down her cheeks with no regard for her carefully applied makeup. I've been looking for you for 15 years, she whispered. Ever since I found out you existed. I hired private investigators, spent thousands of dollars, followed every lead that went nowhere. And then this morning you just appeared. You saved me. Marcus felt like he was drowning in information he couldn't process, implications he couldn't accept. His mother had been the most honest person he'd ever known, had raised him with stories about integrity and truth, and the importance of facing reality, no matter how difficult. The idea that she had kept something this monumental from him felt like learning she'd been a completely different person than the woman he'd loved and grieved. I don't understand, he said, his voice hoarse. My mother never. She would have told me if I had a sister. She wouldn't have kept that from me. She might not have had a choice, Victoria said gently. Marcus, there's so much I need to tell you. So much you deserve to know. But not here, not like this. She gestured around the elegant restaurant, which suddenly felt like the wrong setting for revelations that could reshape a lifetime of assumptions. Marcus stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor with enough force to draw glances from nearby tables. I need to go. I need to think. Victoria rose as well, wincing slightly as her injured ankle took her weight. Please don't run away from this. I know it's overwhelming, but overwhelming. Marcus laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Lady, I don't even know what this is. You show me a picture of my dead mother and tell me we're related, and you expect me to just accept that? I have a daughter to pick up from school. I have a life that makes sense. I won't let you destroy that based on some photograph and a feeling." He was already walking away, moving through the restaurant with the determined stride of someone fleeing a disaster. Behind him, he heard Victoria call his name, but he didn't turn around. The hostess looked concerned as he pushed through the front door, but Marcus barely saw her. Outside, the afternoon sun felt too bright, the city sounds too loud. Marcus sat in his Honda Civic for 10 minutes, hands gripping the steering wheel while he tried to process what had just happened. The rational part of his mind insisted that Victoria Sterling was either delusional or running some kind of elaborate scam. The photograph proved nothing. It could have been doctored. Or maybe his mother had simply resembled Victoria's actual relative. But underneath the rational protests was something else, a recognition that went deeper than logic. A feeling that the puzzle pieces of his life had suddenly rearranged themselves into a picture he'd never expected to see. Victoria's eyes when she'd shown him the photograph. The desperation in her voice when she'd said she'd been looking for him for 15 years. The way she'd known his name mattered before he'd even said it. Marcus started the car and drove toward Sofia's school. But his hands were shaking on the wheel, and his mind was cycling through every conversation he'd ever had with his mother about their family history. Maria Rodriguez had always been vague about her past, claiming that some things were better left buried, that looking backward was less important than moving forward. He'd assumed she was protecting him from whatever poverty or trauma had shaped her early life. He'd never considered that she might be protecting him from something else entirely. By the time he reached Sofia's school, Marcus had made a decision that felt both inevitable and terrifying. He was going to find out the truth, no matter how much it might cost him. Because if Victoria Sterling really was his sister, if his mother had hidden an entire person from him, then everything he thought he knew about his life was built on a foundation of carefully constructed lies. And Sofia deserved to know if she had an aunt she'd never met, family beyond the small circle of two that had defined her entire world. The elementary school playground buzzed with the controlled chaos of afternoon dismissal. Children streaming toward waiting parents and buses with backpacks bouncing and voices raised in the particular pitch of freedom that came at 3:15 p.m. Marcus spotted Sofia immediately. She always positioned herself near the oak tree by the main entrance, reading a book while she waited, her dark hair catching the sunlight in ways that reminded him achingly of Elena. Today, though, Sofia looked up from her book before Marcus reached her, her 8-year-old intuition picking up on something in his expression that he thought he'd hidden. "Daddy, you look different. Did something happen with your lady friend?" Marcus forced a smile, gathering Sofia into their usual after-school hug, breathing in the familiar scent of strawberry shampoo and classroom chalk that meant home and safety and everything that mattered more than the chaos swirling in his mind. "Just an interesting lunch, Mija. How was school?" Sofia launched into a detailed account of her day as they walked to the car. Mrs. Patterson had read them a story about dragons. Tommy Morrison had brought his pet hermit crab for show and tell, and the cafeteria had served pizza that was almost as good as the kind we make at home. Her chatter was a lifeline to normalcy, anchoring Marcus to the reality of parent-teacher conferences and homework assignments and the small, manageable world they'd built together. But as they drove home through familiar neighborhoods, past the corner market where Mrs. Chun waved from behind her register, and the park where they spent Sunday afternoons feeding ducks, Marcus found himself looking at everything through different eyes. If Victoria Sterling was telling the truth, if she really was his sister, then Sofia wasn't just his daughter anymore. She was also the niece of someone wealthy enough to eat lunch at Chez Laurent, someone who wore watches worth more than most people's cars. "Daddy, you're doing your thinking face again," Sofia observed from the passenger seat, her small hands folded carefully over the book she'd been reading. The deep thinking face, not the regular thinking face. Marcus glanced at her in the rearview mirror, once again marveling at his daughter's ability to read emotional subtleties that most adults missed. "Just processing some new information, baby. Nothing for you to worry about." But even as he said it, Marcus wondered if that was true. If Victoria Sterling was his sister, what did that mean for their carefully budgeted life? What kind of obligations came with family connections to a world he'd never imagined joining? And what else might his mother have hidden from him? Other relatives, family history, reasons why a woman who could afford expensive watches and private investigators had been separated from her brother for 32 years. That evening, after Sofia had finished her homework and they'd shared dinner at their small kitchen table, spaghetti with sauce from a jar, garlic bread made from day-old Italian bread bought marked down from the grocery store, Marcus found himself staring at the photo albums Elena had organized during the early months of their marriage. She'd been determined to document their life together, to create the kind of visual family history that neither of them had possessed growing up. There weren't many pictures of his mother. Maria Rodriguez had claimed to dislike cameras, always deflecting attempts to photograph her with jokes about vanity and getting old. But there were a few candid shots: Christmas morning when Sofia was 3, a birthday dinner at the kitchen table, one precious photo of 3 generations taken just months before Maria's death. Marcus studied his mother's face in the photographs, looking for signs he might have missed, clues to secrets she'd kept. Maria had been a woman of routines and careful boundaries, someone who'd worked double shifts as a hospital custodian to keep food on their table and never complained about the sacrifices required to raise a child alone. She'd taught Marcus that family was what you built, not what you inherited, and that the only person you could truly count on was yourself. The contradiction between that philosophy and Victoria's claims felt like trying to solve an equation with missing variables. If Maria Rodriguez had another child, why had she never mentioned her? If Victoria Sterling had been looking for him for 15 years, what had kept them separated for so long? Marcus was still puzzling over these questions when his phone rang at nearly 10 o'clock, jolting him from contemplation of photographs that suddenly felt like evidence in a case he didn't understand. Mr. Rodriguez? The voice was professional, female, not the assistant who had called that morning. This is Dr. Catherine Walsh from St. Mary's Hospital. I'm calling about Victoria Sterling. You're listed as her emergency contact. The words hit Marcus like physical blows. Emergency contact? There must be some mistake. I barely know her. According to our records, Ms. Sterling was admitted 3 hours ago with complications related to her injuries from this morning's train accident. Internal bleeding, possibly from a delayed rupture. She's stable now, but she's been asking for you specifically. She says you're her brother. Marcus felt the world tilt again. The same disorienting sensation he'd experienced at lunch, but magnified by the stark reality of medical emergency. Will she be okay? The surgery went well, but she'll need to stay for observation. Room 412 if you'd like to visit. Visiting hours end at 11. After hanging up, Marcus stood in his small living room, surrounded by the comfortable debris of their evening routine, Sofia's homework spread across the coffee table, the television murmuring with the late news, the familiar weight of decisions that would affect not just him, but the 8-year-old sleeping peacefully in the next room. He couldn't leave Sofia alone, not at night, not when she might wake up from one of the nightmares that still occasionally plagued her 3 years after Elena's death. But the thought of Victoria Sterling lying in a hospital bed, possibly dying, believing he was the brother who had abandoned her to face surgery alone, created a knot of guilt and confusion in his chest. Marcus checked on Sofia, finding her curled under the pink comforter Elena had bought during her last shopping trip, her breathing deep and even with the particular peace that only children could achieve. Her books were stacked neatly on the nightstand, a habit she'd developed on her own, maintaining order in their small world the way Marcus maintained their budget, carefully and with complete attention to detail. He made a decision that felt both necessary and terrifying. Pulling out his phone, he scrolled through his contacts until he found Mrs. Chun from the corner market. Despite the late hour, she answered on the second ring, her voice alert with the concern of someone who understood that late-night phone calls rarely brought good news. Marcus? Is Sofia okay? She's fine, Mrs. Chun, but I have an emergency situation. Would it be possible for you to stay with her for a few hours? I know it's late, and I wouldn't ask if it wasn't important. Mrs. Chun had been their neighbor for 3 years, a widow in her 60s who treated Sofia like the granddaughter she'd never had. She arrived within 20 minutes, carrying an overnight bag and asking no questions beyond the essential details. Her presence transformed their apartment into a safe harbor, allowing Marcus to leave without the crushing anxiety that usually accompanied any separation from his daughter. St. Mary's Hospital at night felt like a different universe from the construction sites and apartment complexes that defined Marcus's daily reality. The fluorescent lights cast everything in harsh relief, and the antiseptic smell mixed with something harder to identify, fear, maybe, or the particular kind of exhaustion that came from confronting mortality in sterile surroundings. Room 412 was in the private wing, a section of the hospital Marcus had never seen before. The hallways were wider here, the lighting softer, the noise level reduced to the kind of respectful quiet that money could buy. Victoria's room was spacious enough for a couch and chair in addition to the hospital bed, and large windows overlooked the city lights in a way that made the view seem curated rather than coincidental. Victoria was awake when Marcus entered, propped up against pillows with an 4-line running into her left hand and monitors tracking vital signs with gentle electronic beeps. She looked smaller in the hospital bed, more vulnerable, but her green eyes still held the same intensity that had unsettled him that morning at the accident site. "You came," she said, her voice hoarse from anesthesia but carrying unmistakable relief. "The doctor said you listed me as emergency contact. I don't understand why you would do that." Marcus remained standing near the door, maintaining distance that felt safer than the intimacy suggested by the quiet room and late hour. "Because you're the only family I have," Victoria said simply, "and because I was afraid I might die without ever getting to explain." Marcus finally moved closer, taking the chair beside her bed. Up close, he could see the exhaustion in her face, the way pain had etched temporary lines around her eyes. Whatever else might be true about Victoria Sterling, her physical suffering was real and immediate. "The doctor said internal bleeding. From this morning." Victoria nodded. "Delayed presentation. Apparently trauma can cause complications hours later. The irony is that if you hadn't pulled me out of that wreckage, I probably would have bled out right there instead of making it to surgery." She managed a weak smile. "You saved my life twice in one day." "Victoria," Marcus said carefully, "I need you to explain what you think you know about my family, about my mother, because what you're suggesting doesn't match anything I was ever told." Victoria shifted against her pillows, wincing slightly as she moved. "What did your mother tell you about her past? About your father? That he wasn't in the picture? That she raised me alone because that's what she had to do? That some men aren't cut out for responsibility?" Marcus had heard these explanations so many times they felt like recited scripture, fundamental truths about the shape of his existence. "She wasn't lying," Victoria said softly. "Just not telling you everything. Marcus, our father was Robert Sterling. He owned Sterling Industries, manufacturing, real estate, some tech companies. When our mother got pregnant with you, she was 19 and working as a receptionist in his downtown office." Marcus felt something cold settle in his stomach. The name Sterling Industries was familiar from construction sites, their logo appearing on equipment and materials. He'd never paid much attention to corporate ownership structures, but now the connection felt loaded with implications he wasn't ready to process. "He was married," Victoria continued, her voice taking on the careful neutrality of someone delivering painful information. "Had been for 15 years. When Maria told him about the pregnancy, he gave her money for an abortion and fired her. She kept the money but kept you too. Disappeared completely. Changed her last name from Sterling to Rodriguez. Moved across the city. Started over." "That's impossible," Marcus said, but his voice lacked conviction. The story Victoria was telling had the ring of familiar patterns: powerful men, vulnerable women, consequences that fell disproportionately on those least able to bear them. "I was born 3 years later," Victoria said. "Different mother, dad's secretary, actually. History repeating itself, except this time he was divorced and could acknowledge paternity without scandal. I grew up knowing I had a half-brother somewhere, but Dad refused to talk about you. Said it was better for everyone if the past stayed buried." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, processing information that rewrote the fundamental assumptions of his identity. His mother hadn't been a single woman who'd made an unfortunate choice with an unreliable man. She'd been a 19-year-old employee impregnated by her boss, then abandoned with money that probably felt like both salvation and condemnation. "How did you find out?" he asked finally. Dad died 5 years ago. Heart attack. When I was going through his papers, I found records, payments to Maria Rodriguez, private investigator reports tracking your movements through elementary school and high school. He'd been watching from a distance, making sure you were okay but never making contact. The revelation hit Marcus like a physical blow. He was watching me? Anonymous donations to your school lunch program when you were 8. A mysterious scholarship that covered half your community college tuition. The construction company that hired you right out of trade school. They got a referral with a cash incentive attached, though they probably never knew where it came from. Victoria's eyes were bright with unshed tears. He was trying to help without acknowledging responsibility. Classic Robert Sterling, generous with money, careful about emotional obligation. Marcus felt the room spinning around him, the careful narrative of his life dissolving into something unrecognizable. Every achievement he'd attributed to hard work and determination now felt tainted by the possibility of invisible assistance. Advantages he'd never known he'd received. You said you've been looking for me for 15 years. Since I was 17. I hired my first private investigator with my trust fund money, against Dad's explicit orders. But you were good at staying invisible, cash jobs, apartments rented under Elena's name, utility bills that didn't quite match up. It wasn't until after Sofia was born that I found a reliable trail. Birth certificate, school enrollment, tax records filed jointly with Elena. The mention of his daughter's name in Victoria's mouth felt like a violation of privacy Marcus couldn't articulate. You've been watching my family? My daughter. Not watching, Victoria said quickly. Just keeping track. Making sure you were safe, that you had what you needed. Marcus, I know how this sounds, but I felt responsible for you my entire life. I grew up with everything Dad's money could buy while you were working construction to pay for community college. I had private tutors and European vacations while you were raising Sofia alone after Elena died. The guilt has been eating me alive. Marcus stood abruptly, pacing to the window that overlooked the city lights, his reflection ghost-like in the dark glass. Below, traffic moved through streets he'd driven thousands of times without ever considering that someone might be monitoring his movements, ensuring his stability from a distance. So what is this? He asked, not turning around. Some kind of charity project? You assuage your rich girl guilt by playing fairy godmother to the half-brother you never knew. It's not charity, Victoria said, and there was steel in her voice now, a hint of the authority Marcus had glimpsed that morning. It's family. It's making right something that should never have been wrong in the first place. Marcus turned back to face her, studying this woman who claimed to share his DNA while inhabiting a world he'd never imagined joining. And what exactly do you want from me? From us? I want to know you, Victoria said simply. I want Sofia to know she has an aunt who loves her without ever having met her. I want to understand what Dad kept from both of us all these years. I want. She paused, seeming to gather courage for whatever came next. I want to offer you something better than what you have now. The offer hung in the air between them like a challenge, and Marcus felt every defensive instinct he developed during years of financial struggle rise to meet it. We don't need your money, Victoria. We're doing fine on our own. Are you? Victoria's question was gentle but pointed. Marcus, I know about the medical bills from Elena's accident. I know about the second mortgage you took out to pay for her cancer treatments. I know you're working 60-hour weeks and still barely making ends meet. I know Sofia qualified for the free lunch program, but you pack her lunch anyway because you're too proud to let her feel different from the other kids. Each revelation was like being stripped naked under harsh lights, every carefully hidden struggle exposed for examination. Marcus felt a familiar rage building in his chest, the same anger that had sustained him through Elena's illness, through the months of learning to be a single parent, through every moment when the world had seemed designed to prove that people like him didn't get happy endings. So you've done your research, he said, his voice tight with controlled fury. You know all about the poor half-brother struggling to make it on his own. Is that supposed to make me grateful? Is that supposed to make me throw myself at your feet in appreciation? Victoria's expression softened with something that looked like understanding. It's supposed to make you realize that you don't have to do this alone anymore. Marcus, I run Sterling Industries now. Dad left me everything, but it should have been ours to share. I'm offering you a place in the company, a chance for Sofia to have every opportunity that money can provide. I'm offering to make you a partner in something that belongs to you by right. The offer was everything Marcus had never allowed himself to dream about and everything he was most afraid to want. Financial security for Sofia, educational opportunities that would ensure she never had to worry about student loans or working multiple jobs to pay for college. A future where she could become the doctor she wanted to be without the crushing weight of economic anxiety that had defined Marcus's entire adult life. But underneath the temptation was something else, the bone-deep suspicion of charity that had been bred into him by years of watching how the world treated people who couldn't pay their way, the pride that had sustained him through every humiliation and setback, the fierce independence that had convinced him he was better off without help than dependent on the goodwill of others. I need to think, Marcus said finally. It's too much to process all at once. Victoria nodded, settling back against her pillows with visible exhaustion. I understand. But Marcus, please don't disappear on me again. I've spent half my life looking for you. I can't bear the thought of losing you now. Marcus was quiet for a moment, studying this woman who claimed to be his sister, who had turned his understanding of his own life inside out in the space of 12 hours. Despite his confusion and anger and deep-seated wariness of anything that seemed too good to be true, he couldn't deny the connection he felt to her, something deeper than shared genetics, a recognition that went beyond logic or careful analysis. I won't disappear, he said finally, but I can't promise anything beyond that. I have to think about what's best for Sofia, not just what's convenient for me. That's all I ask, Victoria said, and Marcus could see the relief in her expression. Just don't shut me out completely. Whatever you decide about Sterling Industries, about the future, I'd like to be part of your life. Both of your lives. If you'll let me. As Marcus drove home through empty streets, his mind churned with questions that had no easy answers. Was Victoria Sterling really his sister? Or was this an elaborate con game designed to exploit his financial desperation? If she was telling the truth about their father, what did that mean about the identity he'd spent 32 years constructing? And most importantly, what kind of life did he want to build for Sofia, one based on the hard-won independence they'd achieved together, or one that accepted help from family he'd never known existed? The city lights blurred past his windows, and Marcus found himself thinking about Elena, wondering what she would have advised if she were sitting beside him in their aging Honda Civic. Elena had possessed an intuitive wisdom about people and relationships that Marcus had always envied. She would have known whether Victoria Sterling's offer was genuine generosity or something more complicated. But Elena was gone, and Marcus was left to navigate this unexpected fork in their road alone. By the time he reached their apartment building, where Mrs. Chun waited with news that Sofia had slept peacefully through the night, Marcus had made one decision that felt both necessary and terrifying. He was going to find out everything he could about Robert Sterling, Sterling Industries, and the father he'd never known existed. Because if Victoria was telling the truth, then Sofia deserved to know the full story of where she came from. And if Victoria was lying, then Marcus needed to protect his daughter from whatever game was being played with their lives. Either way, their carefully constructed world of two was about to become something more complex than either of them had ever imagined. The next morning dawned gray and overcast, matching Marcus's mood as he sat at their small kitchen table with his laptop open and 3 cups of coffee growing cold beside him. Sofia had left for school an hour earlier, chattering about a science project on weather patterns while Marcus struggled to focus on anything beyond the digital rabbit hole he'd been exploring since 5 a.m. Sterling Industries had an extensive online presence that painted the picture of a mid-sized but highly successful conglomerate with interests spanning manufacturing, commercial real estate, and emerging technologies. The company's annual revenue exceeded anything Marcus had imagined, and their corporate headquarters occupied a gleaming tower he'd driven past countless times without ever considering that his name might belong on the building directory. Robert Sterling's obituary from 5 years ago read like a catalog of civic achievements and business success, complete with a photograph that made Marcus's breath catch in his throat. The man in the corporate portrait had Marcus's eyes, the same strong jawline, even the same way of holding his left shoulder slightly higher than his right. The physical resemblance was undeniable, compelling in a way that made every rational argument against Victoria's claims seem suddenly fragile. But it was the archived news articles that really shook Marcus's worldview. A business journal profile from 15 years ago mentioned Robert Sterling's commitment to anonymous philanthropic activities, particularly supporting educational opportunities for disadvantaged youth in the construction and building trades. The piece specifically highlighted scholarships to community college programs and job placement assistance for recent graduates entering the workforce. Marcus remembered the scholarship that had covered half his tuition at Metro Community College. The mysterious benefactor whose identity the financial aid office had refused to reveal despite his persistent questioning. He remembered the construction company that had hired him straight out of trade school, offering better starting wages than anyone else and claiming they'd received a glowing recommendation from someone whose name they couldn't recall. At the time, Marcus had attributed these strokes of luck to his own merit and determination. Now they felt like evidence of invisible hands guiding his path, advantages he'd never earned and never acknowledged because he'd never known they existed. The realization was both humiliating and liberating, humiliating because it challenged his sense of self-reliance, liberating because it meant Sofia's opportunities might not be as limited as he'd always assumed. His phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Marcus, this is Victoria. I'm being discharged this morning and would love to take you and Sofia to lunch. Nothing fancy, somewhere she'd enjoy. Please consider it." The invitation forced Marcus to confront the decision he'd been avoiding since leaving the hospital. He could continue pretending that the previous day had been some elaborate hallucination, maintain their familiar routine of careful budgeting and modest expectations. Or he could introduce his daughter to the woman who claimed to be her aunt, opening their small world to possibilities that felt both thrilling and terrifying. Marcus looked around their apartment, the second-hand furniture Elena had carefully selected and arranged, the photographs documenting Sofia's growth from toddler to confident 8-year-old, the small details that had accumulated into the shape of their life together. Everything was modest but clean, functional but loved, sufficient but never abundant. It was the kind of home built from determination rather than resources, and Marcus had been proud of what they'd created together despite their limitations. But now, studying their familiar surroundings through eyes adjusted to new information, Marcus could see what Victoria had seen, the careful calculations behind every purchase, the way they made do with less because they'd never had the option of more, the subtle signs of financial strain that he'd hoped were invisible to his daughter but probably weren't. He typed a reply before he could reconsider. "Pick us up at Sofia's school. 3:30 p.m. Somewhere with chicken nuggets." Victoria's response came immediately. "Thank you. I won't let you down. Some mornings change everything." For Marcus Rodriguez, that morning began like any other Tuesday, work boots laced, coffee in hand, heading to another construction site to provide for his 8-year-old daughter Sofia. A single father still grieving his wife Elena's death 2 years prior, Marcus had built their life on careful budgets, sacrifice, and an unwavering commitment to giving Sofia stability despite their modest circumstances. Then came the train accident. The screech of metal, the cascade of destruction, the desperate voices calling for help. Marcus didn't hesitate. While others froze or fled, he ran toward the wreckage, using his construction skills to navigate twisted steel and shattered glass. Among the injured, he found an elegantly dressed woman with a severely injured ankle, trapped and fading. Her name was Victoria Sterling, and saving her life would unravel everything Marcus thought he knew about his own identity. Victoria wasn't just a grateful stranger. As Marcus sat beside her hospital bed that evening, she revealed a truth that seemed impossible. They were siblings. Half-siblings, to be precise, sharing a father Marcus had never known. Richard Sterling, founder of Sterling Industries, a man who had abandoned Marcus's mother decades ago and built an empire while his son worked construction sites for hourly wages. The revelation hit Marcus like a second collision. His entire understanding of his origins, his struggles, his place in the world, all of it shifted in an instant. Victoria had known about him for 15 years, conducting discreet research, watching from a distance as he raised Sofia alone, respecting his privacy while wrestling with her own guilt about their vastly different circumstances. Now, with their father recently deceased, Victoria felt compelled to bridge the gap. She offered Marcus a position at Sterling Industries, a stake in the family business, access to wealth that could transform Sofia's future from constrained by financial anxiety to unlimited by possibility. Marcus's initial reaction was a storm of emotions: anger at decades of abandonment, suspicion of Victoria's motives, fear that accepting help would compromise the values he'd worked so hard to instill in Sofia. How could he explain to his daughter that the struggles they'd endured weren't necessary, that wealth and opportunity had existed just out of reach all along? But Victoria proved herself genuine. When she met Sofia for the first time at a family-friendly restaurant, she came prepared, researching child psychology, finding places with excellent chicken nuggets and playgrounds, dressing down to avoid intimidating an 8-year-old with displays of wealth. Most importantly, she showed authentic interest in Sofia's dreams of becoming a doctor, her personality, her life. Sofia, with the remarkable intuition children possess, made her own assessment. Victoria was nice, didn't get weird when I asked about money, and knew about chicken nuggets, the important qualifications for family membership. By the end of that first lunch, Sofia had decided Victoria could definitely be their aunt. The moment that crystallized Marcus's decision came unexpectedly. After playing at the restaurant's playground, Sofia rushed back with excitement about meeting another child whose mother was a doctor. Her question was innocent but devastating. "Do we have money for me to take extra science classes?" That single question illuminated the constant calculations shaping their reality. Every opportunity weighed against practical limitations, every dream filtered through harsh budgetary mathematics. Marcus looked at his daughter's eager face, then at Victoria's carefully neutral expression, and understood that the decision had already been made. Not by Victoria's offers, but by Sofia's casual assumption that money might obstruct her educational goals. Over the following months and years, their family of 2 expanded carefully and deliberately. Victoria kept her promise to respect their autonomy while offering opportunities. She learned to braid Sofia's hair, attended every school play and science fair, and discovered the joy of Sunday morning pancakes that were still only a little burned. Marcus took on responsibilities at Sterling Industries, finding unexpected purpose in overseeing community development projects. His construction experience translated powerfully to creating affordable housing developments. Quality homes for families like his own had been, working people who deserved better than cramped apartments and constant financial stress. They moved to a house in a better neighborhood, but Sofia insisted on bringing her old furniture from their apartment, understanding that some things were too important to replace just because they could afford better. She worked at Mrs. Chen's corner market to earn money for a science kit, even though Marcus told her they could afford it, wanting to make sure she really valued it before spending the money. Victoria had feared that growing up with wealth would spoil Sofia, but Marcus's guidance ensured otherwise. His daughter learned that wealth's value came from understanding its cost, that advantages carried responsibilities, that showing up for people who needed help mattered more than any bank balance. 2 years after the train accident, another hospital visit brought their journey full circle. Victoria fell at a construction site, breaking her wrist, a minor injury that nonetheless reminded all of them about mortality's randomness. As Sofia decorated her aunt's cast with drawings of flowers and dragons, Victoria reflected on how meeting Marcus and Sofia had taught her that life's most important moments happen when you stop trying to control everything and simply show up for the people who matter. 5 years after that fateful Tuesday morning, Marcus stood at a podium celebrating the completion of Riverside Gardens 2, an affordable housing development providing quality homes for 200 families in the very neighborhood where he and Sofia had once worried about utility bills. The original Riverside Gardens had been renovated and expanded, transforming struggling apartments into a thriving community. In his speech to investors, city officials, and future residents, Marcus spoke truth that resonated beyond the ceremony. Family isn't just about biology or shared history. It's about showing up for each other, especially when showing up is inconvenient or complicated or scary. 10 years after the accident, Dr. Sofia Rodriguez Sterling graduated summa cum laude from Johns Hopkins Medical School. Her acceptance speech credited, "A father who taught me that heroes are just ordinary people who refuse to walk away from others in need, and an aunt who showed me that wealth means nothing unless it's used to lift others up." Now a teenager who understood the full scope of what they'd built together, Sofia outlined plans for establishing free medical clinics in underserved neighborhoods across the country, using her advantages to help others who hadn't been as fortunate, carrying forward the lessons of showing up for people who needed help. Marcus, now CEO of Sterling Industries Community Development Division, watched his daughter with profound pride. Victoria, silver-haired and radiant beside him, whispered that Elena would be so proud of everything they'd accomplished together. This story reminds us that life's trajectory can change in a single moment of choosing courage over caution. Marcus could have walked past that train wreck, called 911, and continued to his construction site. Instead, he ran toward danger, pulled strangers from wreckage, and discovered that sometimes the life you save might be your own. The train accident didn't just give Marcus a sister and Sofia an aunt. It revealed invisible threads of connection, exposed injustices that could be corrected, and created opportunities for a family to build something greater than any of them could have achieved alone. Victoria found the authentic family relationships she'd craved despite her wealth. Marcus discovered purpose beyond daily survival. Sofia gained not just financial security but a living example of how privilege carries responsibility. Their journey from a small apartment where they counted every dollar to a life of abundance and purpose took years, but it felt both like a lifetime and like the beginning of something even greater, because they'd built their new life on the foundation of values Marcus had established in those lean years: kindness, appreciation, understanding that not everyone gets advantages they haven't earned. The best stories begin with recognition that we are all connected by invisible threads of need and possibility. Family, real family, is found not in blood alone but in the daily choice to love beyond reason, to serve beyond obligation, to believe that tomorrow can be better than today if we're brave enough to reach for it. Marcus Rodriguez was just an ordinary construction worker heading to work on an ordinary Tuesday. But when crisis struck, he made an extraordinary choice. He ran toward danger instead of away from it. He stayed open to connection when it would have been easier to refuse. He accepted help while maintaining the values that made him who he was. Some stories begin with endings: a train wreck, a life in pieces, hope scattered like debris across unfamiliar ground. But the best stories, the ones that echo through time and inspire others to their own acts of unexpected heroism, remind us that heroes walk among us wearing work boots and carrying tool belts, ready to pull strangers from wreckage and discover that family can be found in the most unexpected places. If this story moved you, please subscribe to our channel, where silence is never forgotten, and every story reminds us that courage, compassion, and connection can transform not just individual lives but entire worlds. Hit that subscribe button and join us for more stories about ordinary people making extraordinary choices. Because you never know when your moment to be someone's hero might arrive.